Right after the death of George Floyd, I tried to process it all. The moment that still haunts me is watching that video of the officer as he put his knee in George Floyd's neck as he said, "I can't breathe." As he begged for mercy and cried out for what we now know was his already deceased mother. That week, as I thought about the other young men of color and all the other men of color that had been subjected to vigilante justice, police brutality, it began to become just a little bit too overwhelming. And I was searching for some type of outlet, and social media was one of them for me. One particular post that I posted was this cartoon. This cartoon was this officer. He was a white, stout officer, and he was talking to a young African-American boy about 6 or 7 years old. And he says to this young boy, he says, "So, young man, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And the young boy says, "Alive." This cartoon spoke to me as an African-American parent because I think it spoke more to a fear. I think that many African-American and parents of color had. There's a study by Rutgers University that says black men are 2.5 more likely than white men to be killed by the police in their lifetime. Another study by the American Society of Criminology says black people who are fatally shot are twice as likely than whites to be unarmed. In a subsequent post, I talked about my son, who was 6 at the time when I was talking about this post, and we were going to the store, and as we were getting out, my son got really excited, and he's like, "Hey, Mr. Policeman, hey, Mr. Policeman." And as we get out, and the police officer greeted us and said, "Hey, young man, how you doing?" What should have been a very just innocent exchange, I couldn't help but be saddened, because what I realized at that moment is that I would eventually have to, this one exchange would eventually be tainted, because I would have to have a conversation with my son about this relationship with law enforcement. Well, that little 6-year-old is now a 12-year-old football and lacrosse player and can be easily mistaken for a teenager. And he's just as tall as I am now. What that means is we had to have the talk a lot sooner than I might have wanted to. What that also meant is, yes, I did have to taint that once innocent relationship that my son had with law enforcement. And just in case you're wondering, what is the talk? It's when parents of color have the unenviable task to tell our kids that a special set of rules exists for them as it relates to law enforcement. And just to be clear, this isn't some esoteric conversation of whether law enforcement is good or bad, because we have law enforcement in my family that we're extremely proud of. But this conversation, this talk, is about survival. So we're talking about the future of men of color and how we're standing here today. As I stand only a few steps away from the Lincoln Memorial, I can't help but think of the March on Washington, which was a little more than 50 years ago. Now, when some people think of the March on Washington, they think of Dr. Martin Luther King and the I Have a Dream speech. Now, I would be remiss if I did not associate my connection with Dr. King, being a Morehouse alum, a Georgia native, as well as a fraternity brother. But as we think about the I Have a Dream speech, most people like to go to the end of that speech because it feels good. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. But you see, some of the most pertinent words of that speech was actually at the beginning. You see, there Dr. King talked about a different type of free. You see, there he said after over 100 years, the Negro was still not free. You see, there Dr. King came to this nation capital actually talking about cashing a check. And he relied on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, where he said the framers had actually signed a promissory note. And that promissory note guaranteed all of us, yes, black men as well as white men, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was the phrase that fueled the impetus phrase that we now hear a lot of time in speeches, the fierce urgency of now. He went on to say that tomorrow is today, and there is a such thing as being too late. So that's why you have to move with vigor and not be complacent. So now as we talk about the fierce urgency of now as it relates to the men of color, we have to know that we have to recognize that we can't settle for status quo. When we say we the people in the preamble, we can no longer let it be duplicitous words and only represent some of the people. You see, on January 6, 2021, our democracy was tested because there was a certain sector of people that decided that it only belonged to some people. So one of our civil rights leaders, John Lewis, said that when you see something that is not right, that is not just, that is not fair, you must speak up. It is these words that propelled John Lewis to accept his role as an agitator when he led a 600-person march in Selma, Alabama on Bloody Sunday. Now, a lot of people like to think of Bloody Sunday only about voting rights, but it also was about police brutality because they was marching for Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old deacon who had been murdered by a state trooper in Alabama. Now I must pause because it is impossible for me to speak about the future of men of color and not recognize the role that police brutality plays in the future of men of color and turn a blind eye to it. We see the through line that police brutality has played, even all the way from Bloody Sunday to now to the likes of Tamir Rice, George Floyd, and all the other names that we will never know. But this is not about demonizing law enforcement, but it's combating the killing of our men of color by law enforcement. Now, I'm here today to say that as we talk about the future of men of color, it's linked to something. It's linked to all of us here looking inside of ourselves and unleashing something called the inner agitator. Now, agitator is defined as stirring up something in others that upsets the status quo. Right now is a time that all of us has to find a way to activate something in us, that we must move something in this world, in our communities. See, Dr. King, he was a great orator amongst anything, among all other things. But one thing he was is a great agitator. It was this that he was able to move all races and classes to create the civil rights movement. Now, I'm a former chief operating officer as well as an HR consultant. So I've done a lot of recruiting. So right now I feel like it's my job to recruit agitators. And at this space, we can always define this when we find our inner agitator. For me, I feel like I came into my inner agitator back in 10th grade in Georgia in my world history class. At that moment, I was wondering, and I made a simple inquiry in my predominantly Caucasian school and my predominantly Caucasian class as to why we were celebrated Black History Month. My teacher informed me that you don't celebrate Black history in world history. You do that in U.S. history. I thought that was an unacceptable answer. And as I told her, being Blacks, as we were all part of the world, we still should be celebrated in world history class. My teacher didn't feel that answer was acceptable as well, and she told me I could be dismissed from class and was escorted to my white principal's office. Eventually, my parents, who also was agitators, and with other African-American parents and other African-American students, we also realized we would stir things up, and eventually, Black history was taught in that world history class that semester. That was a win. But what you realize is you're not always going to have wins. I have to let you know, as an agitator. You know how in the movies, when someone says they get ready to do one of these impassioned speeches, and they stand up, and everyone is spellbound, and then you hear the orchestral music, and after they finish, you hear that one person clap, and then the other person clap, and then you hear the thunderous applause, and it just sounds great. Well, I made one of those impassioned speeches because at my job, I felt like someone had to shake things up. Well, I'm here to let you know, there was no music, there were no claps, and eventually, there was no job. But, once I got over the shock, it was okay. Because what I realized was that I believed so much in what I was doing that I knew if I had to do it all over again, I would. And that's my point today, that sometimes the moment dictates the response and the behavior. Now, I used to believe that everybody couldn't be an agitator. It just wasn't your role. But I don't believe that now. I'm a believer that now there are moments, causes, and events that what I like to call, it makes the tension. It agitates. It's that needed tension. Throughout our lifetimes, whether it was the civil rights movement, right up until now, most recently, the Black Lives Matter movement, is that stillness doesn't work, that you need tension, and that it needs everyone. It needs everyone movement, agitation. And right now, I'm saying that as we talk about what we're doing for the focus of men of color, we need everyone. Some people ask me, what should I do? How should I do it? I can't define that for you. But what I am saying is no one gets to sit on the sidelines anymore. Everyone has to do something. So when you ask me, what is the future of men of color? For me, it's finally cashing that check that Dr. King talked about 50 years ago. The future of men of color for me is what the Aspen Institute talked about, is achieving racial equity, where we hold American society to a higher standard. We don't just focus on individual level discrimination, but we focus on higher social outcomes. So now, as you begin on your journey to finding your inner agitator, you may be a beginner. So I'm going to give you a few tips as you move forward. One, continue to call out racism. Have a plan. Most people said that the reason they had problems calling out racism is they either felt uncomfortable when they saw the behavior. So have a plan. Two, know that whenever you have your social media platforms, use them. Those are crucial to whenever you fight, whether it's social justice, whether it's police brutality, those are key to spreading your message abroad. Three, know that silence is complicity. Recently, there was a George Floyd, put your knee on your neck challenge. Things like that, you have to know that you got to speak out on that. Just deleting it is not enough. Whether it's jokes, memes, whatever someone is doing, you have to speak up. And whenever you see injustice being done to people of color, are you looking the other way? Or are you using your agency and power to make a difference for people of color? And finally, seek allyship in untraditional spaces. Now, I gave you an example about that world history teacher in my 10th grade class. After graduation, we would come back together and have some really poignant conversations. And eventually, we actually would become friends. This was key because my mother, who's an educator, they would come together and have some multicultural programming for my county that was able to help many other students. So you never know where those relationships can do. In conclusion, I will still end with a quote from Dr. King. He says that destinies of blacks and whites are inextricably bound. Without a just world for blacks, there can be no just world for whites. So it is my hope that as we strive for that just world that is linked not only for the men of color's future, but for America's future, that you're inspired and even compelled for that fierce urgency of now to find your inner agitator. Thank you.